Hello, my name is Stephanie. I am a software developer at Namely. If you're not familiar with what Namely does, Namely is a HR platform for growing companies. They are based in New York City and they are hiring. So, if you're interested in learning more or if you're looking for job opportunities, then check us out at namely.com. So, this talk is going to be about code review. So, if you don't do code reviews yet at your company, then ask yourselves, what are you doing? But if you do perform code reviews at your company, then great. This talk is going to help you reassess your code reviewing practices at your company and will help you identify any bottlenecks you might have and will help you figure out how to resolve those bottlenecks and essentially make your development time faster. So one of the most common complaints about code review is that they take too long. But why do they take too long? Well, usually in companies there's not any formal training for code reviews and there's no hard and fast rule about them. So sometimes developers adopt poor practices when it comes to code review, and this can cause them to think that the cost to benefit ratio of code review makes it not worth it. However, if you do perform them well, then it doesn't actually take that long and it can improve development time. So before we get into that, let's talk about why we do code reviews in the first place. Well, one of those reasons is to find bugs. And that's because we are human and nobody is perfect. So when you're working on your code and you finally fix that bug or work on that feature, then you probably think that your code is perfect and you're this special snowflake rockstar developer. But when you review someone else's code, you tend to be more critical of someone else's code than your own, which is why code review works so well for finding bugs. Another reason is because it produces better quality code. And not just because you're finding bugs, but it can help you find potentially better solutions to your code. So let's say if I'm working on a feature and it's up for review and someone can comment, oh, there's actually a better way to do this, or maybe there's a library that already does this. So, and then I'll look at this and be like, oh, okay, that's great. So not only do you produce better quality code because of the collaborative nature of reviews, but it also produces better developers because now I actually know a better way to do that particular thing. And the collaborative nature of that fosters learning, and your developers will learn, which will produce better developers. Then there's also mentoring. So you can also use code reviews as a way to mentor new junior developers. So if junior developers are code reviewing code from their more senior peers, not only does that give them the opportunity to ask the senior peers questions, but it also forces the senior peer to question what they're doing and think, oh, okay, is what I'm doing actually the right way to do this? Because sometimes senior developers lose perspective when they have been doing the same thing for so long. And when they hire a new developer, they may ask, why are we actually doing this? There's actually a better way to do this. So it's a win-win situation. The junior developer learns something, and the senior developer can also learn something. And there's also transparency. So you want to avoid the situation where you have only one developer who knows only this one area of the code that no one knows about. So you want to avoid that situation because what happens if that developer gets hit by a bus, for example? Your team gets screwed because now they have to work with this code that no one knows about. And that's how you end up with comments like, there be dragons. So if you have all code, any new code being reviewed, if everyone is reviewing the code that gets into the code base, then everyone becomes more familiar of all areas of the code. So in the event that one of your developers does get hit by a bus, everyone will know how to handle any situations that will happen within the code base. So what you're probably thinking is, how do you actually perform a code review well? So one thing you should do, and I see a lot of people do this, but this is really critical. You should make sure you do this before you even begin to review the code, is that you should read the issue before you begin the code review. And that's because context is key. The code might be there, but that code has a purpose. And if it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing, then essentially it's wrong. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. So make sure you read the issue and make sure that it covers all areas of the issue and make sure that the code actually makes sense for that issue. And another thing is that you should do is ask questions. If you see a change that you're not quite sure what it's doing, make sure you ask questions, and not just for your own sake. If you ask questions, it will also encourage discussion. And when there's discussion, ultimately, at the end of the day, it will lead to either an equal or better solution to that problem. And another thing to keep in mind when you're doing a code review is that you should be supportive and helpful. So what that means is don't be a jerk. Don't just, during code review, don't just say your code sucks, redo it. And you're going to run into those situations. You're going to see code that really does suck. And you're going to want to tell him just redo it all because it sucks. And that's going to happen. But if you are in that situation, just give constructive criticism. Explain to them why it sucks. There's better ways to say that your code sucks than saying your code sucks. So just give constructive criticism, be positive, be supportive, and don't be a jerk. So what do you actually look for? What should you actually look for in a code review? And this depends, but to start off, here are a few examples. One of them is test coverage. So make sure that their code is actually covered by a test, and make sure that the test that they have written is wholesome and it actually tests the thing that they just coded. You can also look for duplicate code or areas of the code that need to be refactored. Security is one. Make sure that the code doesn't leave any security holes. And anything else, really. What you look for in a code review is going to highly depend on what your level of expertise is in a certain area. So let's say, for example, I'm working on an app and I make a change somewhere on the authentication layer. So if I do that, you probably want to have a few developers take a look at it, as well as somebody who is very familiar with security. And that makes sense because he's better equipped to find bugs or any defects more so than other people. So it's going to highly depend on your level of expertise in a certain area. So what can the author do? What can the author of the code do to make the code review easier for the reviewer? And one of the things you should do is make sure that each set of changes you make before review, it should be one coherent thought. So when you're working on an issue, the code that you write is almost like writing a paragraph in a book. So make sure it solves that issue and it just solves that issue. And make sure if you're working on a large feature, if possible, you could break it up into smaller chunks and each chunk gets reviewed. Because the smaller the set of changes, the easier it's going to be for the reviewer to look at. If you have them review a 300 file change, it's going to overwhelm the reviewer and they're not going to be able to find as many defects as they would if it were a 200 line change. And another thing to keep in mind is to have good version control commit comments. So when the reviewer does take a look at your changes and they look at your commits, it shows them your progress and it also shows them why you made those changes in the first place. And you should also write self-documenting code. So what that means is good variable names, good function names, use comments where appropriate, and if you do write comments, it helps the reviewer if you explain the why of the code and why it's there, rather than just the how or what it does. So And another thing to keep in mind is that you should be a team lead in your own task. And what that means is you should own your code. Make sure that the changes that you make it to production in a timely manner and it is polished. So make sure that anyone during the development cycle, whether that's your code reviewers, whether that's your QA testers, make sure that everyone knows how to handle your changes and that your code makes it to production and it makes it to production in a timely manner and that it is polished. And then you have coding standards. So coding standards and code reviews go hand in hand. So if you do perform code reviews, then you definitely need to have coding standards because you don't want your developers to fight over stupid style changes. And a reason why the coding standards work well are so necessary for code review is because developers will know what to expect. So everyone has to write code the same way. So if developers don't need to worry about the way each person writes code, then they can focus on the functionality of the code, which is what code review is all about. And this in turn keeps code reviews efficient. So that's why you want to implement coding standards especially if you do code reviews. But ultimately, you should have coding standards because you will essentially get improved development speed because not only are you making code reviews more efficient, but you'll also get improved maintainability, testability, portability, and a host of other improvements. So having said that, code reviews aren't black and white. There's actually many different ways to do code review. So we'll go over how different teams do code review and the pros and cons of each and how they compare. And one of the more common ways nowadays of doing code review is on a volunteer basis using pull requests. So for those of you who may not be familiar with what a pull request is, a pull request is simply when a developer wants to request changes to be made to a project. So let's say there's an open source project I want to work on, and I decide to go on their site and I see a bug. So I can go work on that bug on my local branch, and I can request those changes to be made to the project by creating a pull request. And once the gatekeeper of that project approves that pull request, those changes will be merged to the project. So now that you know what a pull request is, in the context of a code review on a volunteer basis, that's when you have all the developers involved in that project looking at this pull request, and they say whether it looks good, or they comment and say what's wrong with it or make suggestions. And when a certain number of developers give the OK, that the pull request gets approved and the changes get merged. So one of the reasons why this is a very common way of doing code review is because it is efficient and it does not interrupt the developer. So because the developer has the freedom to basically recycle their free time, and they can look at a list of pull requests, pick one out, and leave comments if needed. And when developers are working, they tend to be in the zone. And if you interrupt them, or it takes them a while to get back in the zone. So the beauty of this is that doesn't necessarily happen, and they can go and do a code review in their spare time. And another reason is because anyone can participate. So anyone can go on a list of, look at a list of pull requests, pick one out, and leave comments. And everyone should participate because you want to have everyone reap the benefits of code review. And another reason is because it fits neatly into existing workflows. So what that means is whether you use an agile development workflow or waterfall or whatever you use, the beauty of this is that it doesn't require any structured planning on its own. So you can just inject this into your current workflow without interrupting anything. So another way to do code reviews is in groups. So the way this works is you have someone call a meeting, and the person who calls the meeting will invite the developers that they want to do the code review. And during the meeting, the author will go over the changes, briefly go over their changes to the other developers, and then the developers will do the code review during the meeting. So you probably noticed that during group code reviews require meetings. And the thing about meetings is developers tend to not really like meetings because it cuts into their development time. And not only that, it could also interrupt them while they're in the zone. So when they get back to work, they have to get back into it, which can take some time. So group code reviews can take more time than the previous method because they can take more time more than the previous method because not only do they not have the freedom to recycle their free time, but now you have this scheduled block of time where they can only do code review. So let me illustrate this point. So let's say this is a typical day of a developer. So they probably have a couple of meetings, they do some coding, and then they have lunch in the afternoon. So you probably notice that there's these natural occurring points during the day where there's no active work being done or there's no scheduled work being done. So let's say that you employ the first method of doing code review with pull requests. And this is a bit of an exaggerated example because you're probably not going to spend every little bit of your free time doing code review. But the nice thing about the first method is that it doesn't interrupt anything. It doesn't interrupt the natural coding process. So the developer has the freedom to recycle any free time that they have with code review. And let's say you employ the group code review method. So now you have to schedule a meeting. So now you have this block during the day where they have to do code review. So now that you have that, there's some time during the day that some of their coding time during the day is cut off because now they have to go into this meeting. And also that the points during the day where there's no active work being done is now being used for something less productive. So they can take time. And another thing about group code reviews is that it can drift into problem solving. So that can be both a pro and a con, and that will depend on how much time you can dedicate to code review. But if you don't have a lot of time to dedicate to code review and you don't have the resources necessary to schedule another meeting, then it can be a con. And one thing to keep in mind is that the point of code review is to review a solution that has already been implemented. So during the meeting, if you go off on a tangent and discuss other problems that exist while you're looking at the code, then you're essentially not doing code review anymore. So it can be a con, but for others it can be a pro if you do have the time to dedicate to that. And all in all, it doesn't mean it's not necessarily more effective than the previous method. You can only find so many bugs during a code review. So even if you stared at it for 5 hours, there's going to be a finite amount of defects that you're going to be able to find. Some bugs you're just not even going to be able to know how to find, which is fine because the point of code review is to minimize the amount of bugs. You're not going to find every single one. So group code reviews are good if you do have the time to dedicate to it. But if you don't, then maybe the first method of code review with pull requests might work better for you. And then you have peer reviews. So what a peer review is, that's when you have a developer and you have a reviewer sitting side by side next to each other. So the developer will go over their changes with the reviewer, and then the reviewer can say along the way any defects that they see, or they can make any suggestions or ask questions. So that's peer review. So one nice thing about peer review is that it does allow interaction. So an interaction is good because interaction fosters learning and collaboration. And another nice thing about peer review is that it can be used to mentor new developers. So if you have a junior developer, you can get him up to speed by going over your changes with him, and you can also explain to him how that area of the code base works. But it does have its downsides. Peer review does have its downside because one of them is an author can skip a change. Because during a traditional peer review, the review is happening at that moment, so the reviewer might not have a chance to poke around the code. So if the author skips a change, that might leave some bugs being missed. And another thing is that the review is driven by the developer. So if the review is driven by the developer, then the reviewer is not going to be able to, he or she might not be able to think outside the box because they're going by what the developer said. So it's almost like thinking in terms of a checklist. And that might leave some bugs that otherwise could have been caught to be missed. And then you have pair programming. So what pair programming is that's when you have two developers working on the same machine, working on the same problem. And some people use pair programming as a peer review tool because some people pair programming by basically having one person doing all the coding and one person watching them and making suggestions along the way. But the reason why this doesn't quite work so well for a code review is because if you're sitting there making suggestions along the way about the code, then you're essentially coding, basically. You are a developer. There's two developers, not just a developer and a reviewer. So the reviewer is not going to be able to look at this with an unbiased eye. So like we said before, the reason why it's code review works so well for finding bugs is because you are more critical of someone else's code than your own. So if you have two developers there, it's both those developers' code. So they're both looking at this and thinking this is the best code ever. So all in all, pair programming does not equal code review. However, any code review method that you use is going to be better than nothing. So even if you have your 5-year-old kid code review your code and he asks you, what is this? That's still better than nothing because you can explain to them how this code works, and this might jog your memory. This may help spark an idea, and you might come up with a better way to do this. So it's always good to have another set of eyes take a look at your code and keep in mind that any code review is better than nothing. And depending on your company culture and such, there are different ways to do it. So thank you for coming. And if you have any questions, I'm ready to answer them. Yes?
Yeah, are there any times when pair programming or the ones you mentioned just before that could be helpful? Like the only one that I'm thinking of is like if you have a developer who's doing something that nobody's ever done before and there's no one else on the team that knows anything about it, would that be a good time to like have, because sometimes doing something from scratch you kind of need to collaborate? Or would there be like another form for doing that?
I mean, pair programming, you can use pair programming for the programming part of it. And pair programming is one of those things I think it depends on your team. Some people like it and some people don't. And pair programming does have its use cases, like the one that you mentioned. But in the context of code review, it doesn't really work. But if you want to use it to mentor new developers, for example, or work with someone that is very familiar with the code in one area and no one else does, it can work in terms of that. So, any other question? Yes?
When you go cross-functional, do the best practices change?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, in this case, it becomes more of a judgment call. You can, if you come up with a way to combine different ways of code review, you basically have to give it a try. And one nice thing about peer review, for example, is it does allow for interaction. So if your team is, if they like to talk face by face a lot, then you could use that, and maybe use that in combination with something else. So yeah, it becomes a bit of a judgment call, and if you mix and match different ways of doing code review, you will basically mix together both the pros and the cons of those different ways of doing code review. So, any other questions? Yes?
Would the different methods get instituted basically the same way, or would you recommend that the different methods be started out differently?
So yeah, I mean, could you repeat the question, actually?
Yeah, would you recommend that the different methods get instituted differently, or should they all start out about the same?
Well, if you haven't, if your company doesn't do code review yet and you want to introduce it, you should introduce it slowly and basically adjust as necessary. So the different methods that companies employ does depend on their culture. For example, if you work on open source and you have developers working in different countries, the method with pull requests works because it's easy to make comments and approve it if all your developers are not actually meeting face to face. So, any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, the pull request type. What do you do if a request isn't getting picked up by anybody and it's not getting any attention, or the same person's doing all the reviews?
I mean, in that case, you should try to encourage other people to do the reviews, or you have to basically just assign them the pull requests, for example. So if you're running into the issue where only one person is doing all of the code review, then it might be necessary to basically get the other developers to partake in it and start assigning them code reviews. Because everyone should be doing code review because of all the benefits that were talked about. So, any other questions? Yes?
You brought up one thing that struck particularly close to home, and that's sometimes the code review devolves into problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
I've had that happen many more times than once. And I was just wondering if you had any tips as far as how to mitigate that, because should you just tell the developer, okay, you should just revisit the problem, or is it what's the most elegant way to go about reducing the possibility of it devolving into a problem-solving session rather than a code review proper?
Well, in that case, basically, if you do recognize that it is drifting into something else entirely, then yeah, basically you have to say, hey guys, let's get back on track. It's all about communication. So if you do think the meeting is going off to something that it shouldn't be going into, then just say, hey guys, let's get back on track. So yeah. Any other questions? All right, so yeah, if you do have any other questions at the end of the talk, you can email me or send me a tweet. So thanks again for coming. Have a nice day.